everyone, how's it going? Forrest here again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Herr, lieb, ich dich, o Herr, which translates to, apologies, just pulling open the translation right now. It translates to, from my heart I hold you dear, O Lord. My browser had a hiccup there, sorry for the delay. This is a very harmonically dense chorale. It's going to be a longer video just because of the amount of real estate that's going on. There's lots of interesting little harmonic tidbits that are going on as well that I'll talk about as we get there. Regardless, we'll just hop right into the analysis to keep the video from tarrying on any longer than it already is. No sharps or flats in the key signature. We start on C major. We end on C major. I reckon we're in the key of C major. We have a passing tone here in the alto, and then we have G, B, D, and B, which is G major in root position. That's our 5 chord. Passing tones in the inner voices before we get D, D, F, and A. So we have a transitive progression here. D minor is typically in front of the G major, but here it is behind it. Passing 7th in the alto before we get a very interesting chord. We have E, B, E, and G. Now this E minor, which would be a 3 chord in the key of C major, coincides with this F sharp here, so it looks almost like the melody is implying E minor, but we don't modulate away. I think that this F sharp right here is actually some modality in the chorale, and I think this is an instance of Lydian happening, which is very interesting because whenever we encounter like pretty deliberate modality in the chorales, it's always a fascinating talking point. There's really, I can't think of any other ways to justify what's happening here. We have a D major connecting, and kind of like this idea of a D major triad connecting a C major and an E minor triad, and that is really only possible in the G major scale. But because we're in the context of C, that's the equivalent of saying C Lydian. It's very fascinating. But regardless, this 3 takes us to A, C, C, and E. That's A minor in root position, which is 6. Passing 7th in the bass. Passing tone in the tenor before we get F, A, C, and A. That's F major in root position. That's our 4 chord. We've seen almost every chord in the scale. All we need is a 7 chord. Passing tones in the lower voices before we get A, C, F, and A, which is a first inversion F major triad, so no need to reiterate the Roman numeral. And then we have a passing leading tone here that takes us to C major, which is our tonic triad. Now to me, because we have the leading tone in the bass connecting the A and the C, it feels like an imperfect authentic cadence, but if we're judging this cadence just based on its chords, it would technically be a plagal cadence because 4 going to 1 is by definition a plagal cadence, but I think it has imperfect authentic cadential qualities too, because that leading tone in the bass really makes it feel like there's like some dominant quality. There's like some trajectory of a dominant functioning tone connecting to the tonic. If that were absent, it would feel more like a plagal cadence, but I don't know. I think it just depends on how you judge it and how you look at what constitutes or what goes into defining a cadence. Looking ahead, however, we have an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of E minor. So we're looking ahead. This F sharp might have been foreshadowing something because the difference between C major and E minor is, or one of them, is F sharp. But I think we do so through G major. So I think this C major chord is functioning like our subdominant in the key of G major. We then get taken to A, C, F sharp, and C. That is F sharp diminished over A, which is 7-6 in the key of G major. And of course we go to G major after that, G, D, G, and B, which is our tonic triad. Passing tone in the tenor before we get D sharp, F sharp, D sharp, and A. That's D sharp diminished over F sharp, which is a secondary leading tone chord. That is 7/6 of 6, because D sharp is the leading tone to E, and E is our submedian, or our 6. And then we get it again, or we get the chord that we would expect after that. We have E, B, E, and G, which is our 6, and also in the key of E minor, it is our tonic. And we have the same sort of passing figure, or a similar passing figure that we have in the melody here, but here it is being contextualized in E minor, which makes a little bit more sense for Bach's time than the use of sort of forcing this F sharp into a C major context, which is very fascinating. But this A is also a passing tone. And then we get another E minor triad, E, G, B, and E with a passing 7th in the bass. No need to reanalyze. We then have C, G, E, and A. That is A minor 7 over C, which would be 4, 6, 5. And then we have A and F sharp happening at the same time here, which kind of turns the chord into like a 7 chord, but I think that is just foreshadowing what's going to happen next, because we have the F sharp, the C, the E, and the A happening deliberately on beat 2, which would be the equivalent of saying 7 half diminished 7. And then we have some non-chord tones going on in anticipation in the tenor, a neighbor tone in the alto, another non-chord tone in the bass, where we have B, B, D sharp, and A, which is kind of the equivalent of saying 5, 7, but I really just, when I see 7 and 5 connected to one another, and I'll work on my handwriting while this is happening, apologies for the sirens in the background, but when we see 5, 7, and 7 connected to one another, I just look at it as one big dominant gesture, but because the B is deliberately in the bass here and it's doubled, I feel like it's intentional. It feels like it should have its own label. Sometimes it doesn't really feel that way. But then it takes us to E minor, E, B, E, and G, which is our tonic triad and root position. Okay, looking ahead, we have a perfect authentic cadence in the key of C major, but I think we go through A minor to get there. We have E, C, E, and G. I think the C is an accented non-chord tone and we don't need to mark it, but of course, if you look at that C as a chord tone, you could mark this as 6, 6. That's up to you though. We then have F sharp, A, E, and A. There is an argument to be made. I believe that this is a root position F sharp minor 7 flat 5 chord, which would be in the key of E minor 2, 7, half diminished. But I think actually this E is a 7, 6 suspension over the bass, and this D is actually our chord tone. So I think this is actually D major in first inversion, which would be 7, 6. And I think this is also where we are modulating to the key of A minor. This D major chord is actually our major 4 chord as well. We've been seeing Bach use this a lot recently, or at least in the chorales that we've been looking at recently. 4, 6 is a harmonization of the melodic minor scale, and this bass is turning from our tonic into starting from our dominant up the A minor or A melodic minor scale. So this F sharp is just the raised 6th scale degree of the melodic minor scale. And I guess with that same argument that this could be 2, 7, this could also be 6, 7. We then have G sharp, E, C, and B. I think this C is an accented non-chord tone here, and really it's this B that we're looking for. That would make this E major over G sharp, which is 5, 6 in the key of A minor, and of course we go to A minor after that, A, E, A, and C, which is our tonic triad and root position. Passing tones in the melody and the tenor. We have another A minor chord similar to the figure that we had here with this delayed 7th going on, where we had the same phrase here in E minor. We're getting the same thing here in A minor, or something very similar. We then have F, C, A, and D in the key of A minor, that is 4, 6, 5. Again, seeing a similar pattern to here with less bass ornamentation as well as less of an active tenor line. This D is kind of like putting the chord in root position, but we get rid of the 3rd if we analyze it that way, so I'm just going to talk about it. We then have G, B, G, and G, B, G, and D. Apologies, this is where there's some change of analysis going on. This is not a 4-6-5 chord, apologies. I think this A minor is actually where we're getting taken to C major. We can call this a 6 chord. 6 goes to D minor 7 over F, which would not be 4-6-5, but rather 2-6-5. And then we have G, B, G, and D, which is our dominant in the key of C major with the passing 7th of the alto, and then we cadence on C major, which is our tonic. Sorry, we have this brief visitation of A minor. It's almost like an extended tonicization where instead of just getting its dominant, like a secondary dominant, we get one extra chord, which I think is a modulation, a short one, but a modulation. Okay, looking ahead, we have what I'm calling a half cadence in the key of C major, but I think you could also analyze it as a imperfect authentic cadence in the key of G major. I'll let you decide what you feel is the most appropriate. We have another C major chord here, C, G, E, and C. No need to reanalyze. We then have F, A, F, and C, which is F major in root position. That is a 4 chord, passing 7th on the bass. And then we have D, A, F, and B. That is B minor 7 flat 5 over D, which is 7, 6, 5. Or 7-6, depending on how you look at it. Actually, I do think this A right here it looks kind of like it's part of a suspension, so I'm going to call this a 7-6 chord rather than a 7-6-5 chord, even though I think 7-6-5 could also be an accurate analysis. That's really just splitting hairs. We then have A, C, E, and C, a bit of a deceptive progression. We seldom see 7 going to 6, especially diminished 7th going to 6. Regardless, we have some passing tones going on in the upper 3 voices, D, D, and B, with an A in the bass. Doesn't really spell anything too much. We then have A, G, C, and A. I don't really think anything's going on too much there either. So I think this A might be an accented non-chord tone, the C might be an accented non-chord tone, and so is this A. And with that, we're left with G, G, B, and B, which is like saying a 5 chord. And if we were analyzing this as an imperfect authentic cadence, this is where we would modulate from, I think, from this G major chord. We then have F sharp, D, A, and C, which is D7 over F sharp. That's a secondary dominant chord, 5-6-5 of 5, passing tone in the bass, neighbor tone in the tenor, before we get D, D, F sharp, and C, which is like taking the chord and putting it in root position. So we'll just change the figured bass to reflect that it's a root position 7 chord. And then we go to G major, G, D, G, and B. And I hear this as the dominant. I feel like B wants to resolve up to C here. But if you wanted to analyze this in the key of G, you totally could. You can call 5-1, 5-6 of 5 is just 5-6. This figured bass stays the same, and 5 becomes 1. Regardless, I still think we're in the key of C major, so no need to remodulate back because we are back in the key of C major by the time we hit this G major chord. We have a passing 7th in the bass. We have E, G, G, and C, which is our tonic triad and first inversion. Passing tones in the alto and the bass before we get C, G, E, and D. We could make the argument that this is sort of like a tonic triad in root position, but I think this C and this E are both accented non-chord tones, and what we really have is B, G, D, and D, which is a first inversion dominant triad that then goes to our tonic C, G, E, and C in root position. We have passing tone in the melody before we get D, D, F, and A, and we might be tempted to call that a 2 chord because it looks like a 2 chord on the downbeat, and I think that analysis would be accurate if that's your outlook on it. But again, we have one of these 7-6 chords that I think hides in plain sight behind a 2 chord, B, D, D, and F. So 7-6. And on the other side of this progression, we would expect a tonic triad in first inversion, which is what we get. E, C, G, and C, which is our tonic triad in first inversion. And then we're preparing for what I'm calling another half cadence in the same fashion that this half cadence that we have here feels half cadential to me. Another one of these sort of cadences that could be analyzed as an imperfect authentic cadence, but depends on how you hear it, depends on how much stake you put in the melody versus how much you put in the harmony that's supporting it and which one overrides the other. In this case, I feel like the melody still has too strong of a hold over the harmony so that it still sounds like a half cadence, even though imperfect authentic cadence isn't too far off. This one feels much more, or maybe not much more, but it feels objectively more like a half cadence than this one does. And that's probably in part because there's only one F sharp and it happens right before the G major triad. So we have a passing tone here in the tenor, F sharp, A, and C. I think this D is an important tone here, so you could analyze this as a root position 7 chord of 5, because this would be F sharp diminished, but I think this D actually plays a role, and this is actually 5, 6, 5 of 5, but that's just, again, splitting hairs, just like how the 7, 6 chord could be analyzed as 7, 6, 5. It just depends on how you hear it, and just the relationship you have with the harmony. We have G, G, D, and B, which is our 5 chord. That ends our phrase with a half cadence. We then have a phrase that ends in a perfect authentic cadence in the key of C major. So we start things off with G sharp, B, E, and E, passing 7th here in the alto. This is E7 over G sharp. This is secondary dominant. Sorry, the handwriting is getting a little cramped here. It's reminding me of my early days when I was still using cutouts from the anthology that I was analyzing out of. But this would be 5, 6, 5 of 6, because A is the 6 of C major and G sharp is the leading tone to A, or E is the dominant to A and the G sharp is functioning like the leading tone. If this were a diatonic chord, it'd be E minor rather than E major. And we would expect an A minor chord after this, which is what we get. We have A, C, and F, but I think this E is actually our chord tone, even though this could be a roundabout way of saying that this is a deceptive chord progression. If you look at this F as the chord tone, it's an appoggiatura. But I do think the A minor is our target here rather than F major, but the analysis is there if you want to analyze it like that. We then have B, D, G, and D with a passing 7th in the alto. This would be G major over B, which is 5, 6. And then we have C, C, E, and E, which is our tonic triad, C major in root position. Passing 7th in the bass, passing tone in the tenor, and passing tone here in the melody. We have B, D, E, and B. Not really analyzable. It's like an incomplete E minor 7 chord over B. There's no third in the chord. I'm not sure how strong that analysis is, but there are some notes that are there that you could try and extrapolate something from. We then have A, E, A, and C, which is A minor. That's our 6th chord. Passing tone or passing 7th more specifically in the bass. F, D, A, and C. D minor 7 in first inversion. Bach loves 2, 6, 5 chords. This D is another one of these tones that kind of looks like it's putting the chord in root position, but it's getting rid of the third in the process, and we would have an incomplete triadic foundation when doing that, so I don't really think it's that strong of an analysis. We then have G, D, G, and B, root position G major triad, that's our 5, and then we cadence on C major, C, E, G, and C, our tonic triad. Then we get a perfect authentic cadence in the key of G major, and I think we modulate not straight away, like the C is not eliding with the key of G major. I think it feels like this G major very easily could go to C, considering how long we've been in C major for. So I think this G major could function both as 5 in the key of C as well as our tonic in the key of G. As opposed to saying we're going from 1 to 4, this G major chord could springboard off to C, but it doesn't. It stays in the key of G major, so that's where it feels like the modulation is happening to me, but the modulation could happen as early as the end of the previous phrase. We then have G, D, A, and C. This G is in a lower suspension. It could be like a don't know, like a 5-6 lower suspension, or maybe more likely a 9-10 lower suspension under the alto. But really we have F sharp, D, A, and C, which would be the equivalent of D7 over F sharp, which is 5-6-5. We then have F sharp, D, G, and B. I think this F sharp is an accented non-chord tone, and this D is an accented non-chord tone as well. So I think what we really have is E, C, G, and B, and that's like C major 7 over E, so a bit of a transitive progression here. We have 5 going to 4, C major 7, coming after a D7 chord. It's interesting, descending passage in the bass is pretty peculiar. I don't think I've encountered it before in the chorales, or anywhere. Not that I've really looked at a ton of Bach's music before this, but yeah, a 5 going to 4 is definitely an unusual progression. E going to C, or sorry, E, C sharp, F sharp, and A. I think again we have this pattern of accented non-chord tones here happening, and it's just a gestural repeat of what's happening on the previous 2 beats. What we're really looking at is D sharp, B, F sharp, and A. That would be a B7 chord over D sharp, which would be 5-6-5 of 6, because B is the dominant of E, and E is our 6. And then we get E minor after that, E, B, E, and G, with a anticipating 7th in the bass. We then have D, B, E, and G. I think again we have this same gesture going on where we have accented non-chord tones here. We have A, C sharp, E, and G, which is another secondary dominant. That's A7 over C sharp, which is 5-6-5 of 5 this time, because A is the dominant of D, and then we get D afterwards, D, A, D, and F sharp, which is our 5 chord in the key of G major, and then we cadence on G major, G, B, D, and G, which is our tonic triad and root position. Alright, we have a short phrase after this. It's only a couple beats long. It's only about a complete measure long, or 3 beats plus 1 beat long. And I believe it's in the key of A minor, and we have end and a half cadence. This E major chord. It's kind of an interesting chord progression. We have, and it's the handwriting is going to get very cramped here, but we have C, G, E, and C. That is a C major chord in root position, which is 4 in the key of G. It is also 3 in the key of A minor. We have some passing tones in the inner voices. That spells F sharp, A. Well, actually, I want to think about whether or not this is actually what's happening here. I'm going to walk that back and say that that's not where we modulate, because 4, yeah, I'm gonna say that that's not what is happening here. Actually, this C major is still gonna be our 4 chord. We have passing tones in the inner voices because we have 4 going to 1, G, B, G, and D, which is our tonic triad. Here in the inner voices, we kind of have like a passing F sharp, A, C, and E, which is like a passing 7 half diminished chord in second inversion, so 7, 4, 3 going to 1, so 4, 7, 1 happening. That's a normative progression. Passing 7th here in the alto before we get A, C, E, and C. That is a supertonic chord, that is 2. Which I'm going to say is where we modulate to the key of A minor. It is now our tonic. That looks a little bit more accurate to me, and now that I'm playing it back in my head, I think that sounds a little bit more accurate as well. And in passing, we have A, D, F sharp, and C, which is kind of like a passing 4 chord in second inversion, the same way that we get this passing 7 chord in second inversion. This is a D7 over A, so 4, 4, 3, which then goes to 5. I need to rewrite that so I have a little bit more space. I'm going to put 2 a little bit more over here, then do 4, 4, 3, and then we cadence on 5. There we go. Of course we cadence on 5 because this is a half cadence, E, E, G sharp, and B. And then we're looking ahead to our next phrase, which concludes with a perfect authentic cadence in the key of C. I'm so sorry if I sound a little scatterbrained in this video. There is a lot of real estate to cover. I've been using the term real estate a lot in my videos recently, just to describe how much content lies on the page proportionate to how much of the page the score takes up. And in this case, there's a lot of content on the page. We've been having some longer chorales recently. Alright, so here we have C sharp, E, A, and E with the passing 7th in the alto. This is A7 over C sharp. We've seen this chord before. This is, A over C sharp would be a secondary dominant. It would be 5 of 4 in this case, because A is the dominant of D, and D is our subdominant, or our 4. And then we move to D minor, D, A, F, and F, with the passing tone in the melody. That's our 4 chord. It also happens to be our 2 chord in the key of C major. And this makes sense because 2 is going to go to 5. G, B, G, and D, with the passing 7th in the alto. It's our 5 chord, G major. And then we have C, C, E, and E, which is our tonic triad C major, sorry. It's because we had 2 E's, that's what I was thinking about. We have D, C, F, and B going on here as chord tones off the harmonic rhythm. Nothing, I think, to analyze there, because it's not really, you'd have to stretch to really make the argument that a chord is happening there, but there are some notes that you could infer a chord happening there. Here we have E, C, G, and C. That's just taking our previous C major triad and rotating it to first inversion. Some more passing tones in the lower voices before we get G, E, G, and C. Again, we're just rotating the tonic triad from first inversion to second inversion. This C is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. We have G, D, G, and B, which is G major. That's our 5 chord. Sometimes we use a bracket to signify second inversion tonic triads with the dominant, because they are often a pair. Some people look at 6-4 as not just an accessory, but an ornament to 5. That's what the bracket signifies. That's just how I came up doing it. It doesn't matter really if you write it in your own analysis. But then we have C, E, G, and C, which is our tonic triad and root position in C major. Okay, so looking ahead, we probably have the most interesting progression happening here, but before we talk about it, we have a perfect authentic cadence at the end of this phrase in the key of C major, so no more modulations. Here we have A, E, and C. We might be tempted to call this 2, but I think this F sharp is a little bit more significant. I think this is actually a secondary leading tone chord, 7, 6 of 5, because F sharp diminished is the leading tone chord to G major. But instead of going to G major, this voice resolves the way that we would expect, but the notes around it spell something entirely different. We go from F sharp diminished to C7, E, C, G, and C, with a passing 7 here. So we could make the argument that we are going to our tonic, but actually I think we're going to 5, 6 of 4. So we skip the resolution entirely to opt for another secondary dominant functioning chord. And the second of the chords does resolve the way we would expect. F sharp, A, F, A, F, and C, which is our 4 chord and root position with the neighboring 7th of the alto. But this progression here, having a secondary dominant that doesn't resolve, I had to check a couple of versions, and that's what was written. It's really fascinating. If we think about F sharp diminished going to C7, the roots are a tritone apart, which is interesting. And the only scale in which those 2 notes exist, C7 and F sharp diminished, that only scale that those 2 exist is like G melodic minor. And I don't think that I'm really getting those vibes from this, even though we have, I guess, 6, 7, 1 and G melodic minor here, and the B flat. It just does not sound like we're in G minor with a C static tone in the melody. And no G in the bass. So that's just my opinion. But it's interesting that we have F sharp diminished going to C7. Very unusual chord progression here. Definitely one of the wackier chord progressions I have encountered while looking at the chorales thus far. We then have B, A, F natural, and D. I think this A is a 7/6 suspension over the bass. What we're really looking at is G7 over B. That's 5/6/5, what we would expect to come after 4. And then we get C major, C, G, E, and C, which is our tonic triad and root position with the passing 7th in the bass. We then get A, F sharp, A, and C. That is F sharp diminished over A, another one of these secondary leading tone chords. That's a 7/6 of 5. Both of the notes resolve the way that we would expect them to in the lower voice. The lower voice is F sharp goes up to G and A goes down to G before we get F sharp, A, D, and C, which would be F sharp, D7 over F sharp, which would be 5/6/5 of 5. Again, when we see 7 and 5 next to one another, it really is just one larger dominant gesture. It's something that I call a static chord progression because the functions of the two chords are similar. So when the two chords are functioning in a similar fashion, but you're not seeing the same chord voiced twice over 2 beats, yes, there is a progression suggesting the fact that like at least one of the voices is moving, but the trajectory of the progression hasn't changed yet because we haven't seen a chord with a different function. We don't know if it's going to a tonic, we don't know if the cadence is being delayed, but because we could look on the page and see the cadence is coming, I just look at this as like dominant counterpoint. That's what's functioning. That's the function of the music right now. Regardless, we have G, G, D, and C here. This is definitely implying a 5 chord with a 4/3 suspension in the melody that gets resolved to on beat 4 before we cadence on C major, C, G, E, and C, marking the end of today's analysis. This was a very heavy chorale, a very long video. Thank you for watching it. If you watched it in its entirety or if you watched it for any length of time, a lot of work went into analyzing this chorale. There were interesting chord progressions all throughout it, whether they were the diatonic progressions like the one at the beginning where we don't see the same chord twice until the end of the progression, and we see every diatonic chord except for a 7 chord, which we even get hinted at right before the cadence, or if we see 2 secondary dominants that aren't related to one another and don't get resolved in between them. Definitely a very dense chorale. It's refreshing in a way because I haven't seen a chorale with this amount of density in quite some time, and it was a challenge to analyze. Definitely one of the more difficult chorales that have been analyzed on the channel, and it was a pleasure to do so. But on that note, I'm going to cap off today's video. If you're interested in following me along on this journey to analyze all of the chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe and hit the notification icon. I upload once a day, so if you want your daily fix of Bach or daily fix of analysis or both, you're in the right place, and you'll get notified of when I upload at some point during the day when I have some free time to record and sit down and analyze the chorale that we'll be covering for the day. But regardless, thank you so much again for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.